Today I will be, talking mainly about, like I said, mostly the early 1900s, getting into, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. We'll talk about the Taft and Wilson administrations that also follow, like I said, in American history. Moving on today, like I said, I'm going to, of course, mostly talk about the Teddy Roosevelt era, which we've kind of already talked about a little bit about, I think, the domestic policies of Teddy Roosevelt. I know we got into that already at this point, but I'm going to go in today, and I'm primarily going to talk about the foreign policy issues that are pretty important under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Anyway, Teddy was president from 1901 to 1909. I believe I said that already. I think we talked about a few of his domestic policies. He's a trust buster and all that. And of course, he was famous for his square deal with the American people. He's one of the first presidents to basically kind of give everybody equal footing, not just business, whatever, capitalism, but also the little guy, the average person, American citizen overall. But today I'm going to get into and talk about Roosevelt's foreign policy issues, which, by the way, heavily dealt with Latin America, what they call big stick policy, that he often, I guess, called it more or less. And he had this famous quote he loved, by the way, which was, by the way, an African proverb, which was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far, young man." So I mean, he's kind of love that famous quote. And anyway, what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do as president, he wanted to strengthen the Monroe Doctrine. He believed that was kind of an issue that, was a policy that they wanted to try to push in the country. And of course, one of the things he's going to do as president is, of course, he's later going to build the Panama Canal. We'll get to that later. It's one of the things he's well known for, of course. I'll get to that later about that issue. But some of the things, of course, he's well known for, which I'll talk about first, is his big stick diplomacy, which dealt, like I said, with Latin America. By the way, the quote came from a Minnesota State Fair where he gave this speech in 1901. And he made that famous proverb quote right there. And so the actual thing stuck more or less. So everybody kind of thinks of that. And Teddy also saw the presidency as a bully pulpit where he could, pretty much put whatever kind of policies he wants to do into play. And he began strengthening the Monroe Doctrine. He believed that no other country should go in, like foreign power, especially in Europe, should be able to intervene except the United States, because it's believed to be our sphere of influence in the Americas. And so in 1904, he issued this thing called the Roosevelt Corollary, which they talked about in the video. And it said that basically if there's kind of a problem with a country, say one of the countries like Mexico doesn't pay its debts, he believed that the only country that should be able to go into Mexico and deal with it should be the United States. So we should be allowed to intervene to prevent, like, I guess, conflict, where foreign countries might go into America and cause a big war over an issue. And it has been tested a few times. We'll get to that later, but I think the Monroe Doctrine has been tested numerous times, of course, at this time and, of course, later throughout the Americas. He did, and by the way, the big stick they're talking about is the use of threat, like a force, is what it is, to kind of prevent it. But if they did send troops in, it was called gunboat diplomacy. So there are cases where the Marines had to be sent in to make them pay their debts or whatever. That's what it was. And so that happened a lot. Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and a few other countries like in most of the Caribbean, I think it is. We did actually do that, where we sent forces in, not just under him, but other presidents that were later, in the future, you see at the modern times, like under Reagan, under George H.W. Bush, like when in the Panama, things like that. It's kind of an extension of that. the Roosevelt Corollary in gunboat diplomacy. Of course, in Latin America, they did not like it. You know about that. They still don't like us. In Latin America, they talk about Yankee go home, and things like that. So they don't like us going into their countries and interfering with them, more or less. But I think a lot of this had to do with trade, more or less, because we're kind of concerned that other European powers will go into Latin America, and then we won't have as much trade with those countries. And so I think that had a lot to do with it, more or less, because of capitalism and things like that. All right. I also kind of give examples of some of the so-called big stick diplomacy, that had been tested, the Monroe Doctrine numerous times, and got a few of them right there on the list. Yeah, I've got three right here. Mexico, Venezuela, twice, of course, you can see there. Yeah, it's been threatened several times. One, of course, you have the Mexican intervention by the French, where the French went in there into Mexico and took over their country, 1861, 1867, because they owed like debts or something like that. And so the Emperor of France, I think it was Napoleon III, put one of his cousins on the throne named Maximilian, Emperor Maximilian I, they called him. And the Mexicans fought for years to kick him out. You know this. Finally drove him out in 1867. Then in South America, you had Venezuela and the British Guiana fought over their border. It was kind of a border dispute, 1895. And Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, had to intervene and almost caused a war between the United States and Britain. Most people don't know about that one. Then Venezuela in 1902 refused to pay their debts that they owed to European countries. And so actually there was threat of war breaking out, believe it or not, in Venezuela. And Teddy Roosevelt had to kind of intervene also with that as well. And there was this guy named Luis Drago, who was, by the way, foreign minister to Venezuela. He issued what they call the Drago Doctrine. And he said that no one could come into like a country like Latin America, like say Venezuela, and force them to pay their debts. Only they could arbitrate with it. He thought, like, no gunboat diplomacy. He thought that was illegal, basically. Yeah, that's pretty much their view, in Latin America. But at the time, like I said, the Americans were kind of concerned about trade in general, keeping control of that region and keeping the Europeans out, more or less. Of course, the thing I'm going to get to that's the most famous thing about, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, is, his administration was the building of the Panama Canal. It's really his best, I think, achievement as president is really that. So his greatest foreign policy success overall. It was built between, by the way, 1904 to 1914. So it took about 10 years to build. The Panama Canal was pretty important because it shortened the distance between going from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean or vice versa. If you know before that, how things were done, you wanted to go from, say, East Coast United States to the West Coast of the United States, you had to either go around South America, like sail a ship, or your other option was, by the way, to sail to like where Panama is, cross it, and get on a ship on the other side and go up the other side of the coast in Pacific. That's basically the way you could have done it. So I think they did that starting in the 1850s after the California Gold Rush started. So because there was no railroads or anything that go across America, before like the 1860s and 70s. So basically that was the best way to get there, unless you want to get killed by Indians trying to cross the plains and all that. It's more safer, I guess, going that way. Now, the French, by the way, first tried to build the first actual canal. They actually attempted it before that. I think I want to say in the I think it was 80s, I believe it was. Yeah. And built, I think, in Nicaragua, I believe it was. And anyway, the canal failed. If you know about this, they went bankrupt. The climate was horrible, for building a canal. A lot of the people got like malaria, died. I think most people that died in building the canal was mostly from basically the one that was built by the French. Ferdinand Lesseps, you may have heard of him. He was the famous engineer who built the Suez Canal, which of course was built in the late 19th century. So basically, that was more successful originally, which, connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. So you can get into the Indian Ocean. Shortcut for there too as well. Before that, you had to go around Africa, which is kind of a long way. Now, under John Hay, who was the Secretary of State, who we talked about before, he started trying to negotiate with Colombia to basically get some land where the Isthmus of Panama is so they could build this canal. And so they thought that would be the best way to put it because it's, a very narrow strip of land. I think it's like 40 miles wide. That would be easy, of course, to basically build it there than, say, Nicaragua or somewhere to the north, Central America. The only problem was the Colombians, wanted too much money. That became a big, big issue between the Panamanian government, the Colombian government and the American government. And it got to the point where the negotiations soured so bad that it angered Teddy Roosevelt. If you know the term, I don't know if you ever the slang term of what they call somebody who's Latin or Italian, which is a dago. He said something like, "Those damn dagos want too much money." I think they wanted like 20 million and they were offering them 10 million, I think, for some of the land. And it was like only like a little strip of land, that was like not that big of an area we're talking about. It's not like they wanted the whole thing, whole Panama, they just want a little strip to build it, basically. And anyway, what happened was they believed the Americans backed some kind of revolution in the Isthmus of Panama. They call it the Panamanian Revolution, 1903. And just so happened a U.S. gunboat shows up. That's been all planned, which was the USS Nashville. And next thing you know, the United States is saying, "Hey, Panama, you're now a separate country. You're an independent nation." And so we backed the revolution. Of course, we angered the Colombians, I think, about that. I'm surprised we didn't go to war with them. But so what happened, because of the fact that now Panama was a separate country, what happened was then Hay went back, John Hay went back to him again and started negotiating with the Panamanians instead. So, hey, we'll give you the same deal they were going to give the Colombians. And so that leads to the so-called famous Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty that occurs in 1903. What exactly was in that treaty, by the way? This is what we were going to give the Colombians, which they didn't want for some reason. The U.S. would be given a 99-year lease on a 10-mile strip of land, basically to build the canal. The U.S. would also pay the Panamanians, you can see, $10 million. Colombians had wanted, by the way, $20 million. Yearly rental agreement of $250,000 that we'd have to pay the Panamanians, every year. So we, control the canal. And so, yeah, it was a pretty good deal, and I almost think we should have just given the 20 million to the Colombians. Probably should have, because later in 1921 we paid them 25 million for Panama itself. So I guess maybe we should have paid the 20 million if you think about it. Or say 5 million, huh? So, but anyway, that's basically how we ended up getting basically that. And Teddy Roosevelt once said that I took the canal and I'll let Congress debate. He didn't really actually go to Congress about it. He just basically help take it basically and try to build it and get it done. So that's the bully pulpit, that Teddy talks about, I guess. I'll talk more about the canal. I do have a little short video I'll show you first about the canal, and then I'll kind of go into it. So let me go ahead and just show that really real quick.
Before 1900, if you wanted to sail from Florida to San Francisco, you would have to sail down the coast of South America and through the Straits of Magellan at Cape Horn. This was a long and often dangerous journey. As early as the 1500s, many countries showed an interest in finding a way to cross from one ocean to the other at the 50-mile-wide neck of land in Panama. Doing so would cut the 14,000-mile sea journey in half. But travel through Panama by foot or train was difficult because of the dense jungle, swamps, extreme weather, and danger of sickness. United States President Theodore Roosevelt came into office in 1901 and knew a canal was the practical answer and was determined to find a way to get it done. Engineers were hired to figure out how to build a canal through the difficult Panama landscape, and the United States put up the money. Construction of the canal began in 1904 and ended in 1914. It was a massive job and took many laborers to complete it. Over 5,000 American workers died from accident or disease during the project. The canal uses a system of locks. Because the water level between the oceans and the lakes in the canal are different, the ships must be raised and lowered. A ship enters a narrow passage, large gates are closed in front and behind the ship, and water is added or drained depending on which direction the ship is going. When the water level is the same as the ocean or lake, the gates are opened and the ship continues on through the canal. Now that the canal is over 100 years old and cargo ships are bigger than they were in 1914, expansions and upgrades have been done along the 50-mile canal. A recent expansion cost $5.2 billion. With around 40 ships per day passing through the Panama Canal, it is one busy place.
It's a little video, of course, on the Panama Canal, of course. And, of course, you can see the map there basically showing like where it was built. And they did put in this artificial lake, by the way, called Baton Lake, just kind of in the middle of it right there. And it cost a lot of money. I think $400 million was the actual cost of the building of the Panama Canal. That time, that was pretty expensive. I don't know what that is now. That's probably in the billions today overall. Yeah, most of the workers were not American. They actually came from the Caribbean, mostly black workers that they hired to work on the canal, did most of the actual real work. And then I guess a lot of upper workers like engineers and things like that, of course, came also from America to work on it as well. You can see about 10% of the workers actually died when they built, the Panama Canal. Actually, way more than that died, I think, when because they usually count the ones that the French, when they built the previous one that failed, more or less. Yeah, about 6,000 Americans died actually in the construction of the canal. Of course, it does have these famous locks. You may have seen these before. That's what they look like when they don't have any water and ships in them right there. It's like 12 of them they built, which were made of cement and steel. And they would raise and lower ships because the fact that you have to understand that the levels of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are not the same. So they have to basically lower and raise ships to get to the correct sea level so they can move on to the different levels, I guess, along the canal. And so you can see each lock is about 110 feet wide. Some, I think, have had to be expanded and all that too, also as well. So something that he's real famous for, Teddy Roosevelt, in the building of it. Here's some other pictures showing you like some better view, like of the locks right here. You can see that ships go in and out of course, to move along the canal. Here's a better map actually showing you the way. But you can see there's two parts. There's one on this side over here, the Atlantic side, and they have the other side, which is also over here as well. So that locks on both sides. Then they have to go through this huge lake I told you called Baton Lake, which is right here to cross Panama. So anyway, yeah, it would actually, the canal itself would open, I think, when World War I broke out in 1914. And I think they were saying that, we would never close to say the Germans or whatever it is. And of course they did. They ended up closing it, if you know about that, of course, during the war. So they let the Germans use it and all that, of course. All right, I'm going to move on. Of course, I'm going to next talk about, we're going to get into and discuss, of course, I want to get into the Taft administration. So I need to go ahead and kind of move on and talk about William Howard Taft, because he was president next that came in from like 1909 to 1913. And there he is right there, Taft. Taft, like I said, we would eventually go on to win the 1908 presidential election. Teddy Roosevelt could have run. He could have run for re-election in 1908 because he really hadn't served 2 terms, and there was no real amendment to stop him from running. So he could have done it. And one thing that is famous about Teddy Roosevelt, he was one of the first presidents to actually handpick his successor, which Andrew Jackson had done, by the way, with back in 1800s. He had done that with President Van Buren, if you know about that. And Taft was the Secretary of War, who was from Ohio. Anyway, if you know about Taft, he had actually been more of a lawyer and judge and had been a professor at Yale. He really didn't like politics, by the way. He wasn't really big into that. I think he once remarked that I hate politics, is what he said. And he wanted really to be like a judge, which he would later. He's actually a Supreme Court judge. In fact, he's the only president that ever became a judge on the Supreme Court. He was Chief Justice, you can see, in the 1920s. And there was a joke about Taft that Taft stood for take advice from Teddy, And anyway, Taft would go on to defeat William Jennings Bryan, who was running again for president for a 3rd time. Of course, people were kind of sick of Bryan, I think, at that point, from Nebraska. And he easily won Taft because of, Teddy Roosevelt being so popular. So Taft was the 27th president, and you can see he only served 1 term, of course, overall. Now, one thing about Taft, which, a lot of people, they think him as this reactionary. There, of course, by the way, there's Jennings Bryan right there, if you want to see that, of course, later. You can see the South holding still, of course, with the Democrats. But Taft was, this man that was not really, a lot of people saw him as a reactionary against the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, but he turns out to be pretty progressive also as well. You can see he had a nickname. He was called Big Lub. And the reason why he was called that was because he was a big man. He weighed like 340 pounds, and he was one of the fattest presidents I think we ever had. If you know the story about Taft, there was a deal where he was taking a bath one day, and he got stuck. He couldn't get out. He was that fat. I think he called him Fat Taft. I think somebody called him or something like that. And anyway, they had to bring in a new bathtub that was bigger so he could, take baths, stuff like that. Oh, it's interesting. He was also the first president, this was true, to play golf. Like, these presidents later, like Eisenhower and others, love to play golf. Trump and Obama play a lot of golf, and that's something they started kind of doing as a pastime, playing golf, etc. But like I said, Taft was, he ends up being unpopular, though. A lot of people don't like him. People like Teddy Roosevelt, he just seems like totally different from him. He does kind of get people the wrong way with, especially like the tariff. I'll get to the Payne-Aldrich tariff. That was something that kind of angered a lot of people. They thought he was trying to be more supportive of like the capitalist industries and things like that. Taft was a trust buster, though. That's something people, forget about. He was known for that. He actually had something like 90 cases that they brought forth under him where they broke up various monopolies, which, of course, the most famous was the Standard Oil Company was actually broken up under him in 1911, but this had been something that had been kind of going on since 1906, going back to under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. It just took a while for them to actually do it. But yeah, he was kind of known for being a trust buster, and people forget that, under him. You can also see the Mann-Elkins Act. That was another thing that came out too under Taft's administration. What was that? The Mann-Elkins Act was this act by Congress in 1920 that began the regulation of telecommunications throughout the country. And so which involved the Interstate Commerce Commission, which I think I mentioned this earlier about that, how they eventually did that too, not just railroads. So they started doing that. Then the 16th Amendment was also ratified as well. I think by the time he went out in 1913 or sometime around that time, but I know 1909 is when the actual income tax was created, which took them like 4 years to ratify. It was very controversial. A lot of states didn't want to do it. And a lot of people still don't like it today, federal income tax either. Of course, one of the most famous things, of course, that really angered people, of course, in the United States was Taft supported the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which came out in 1902, that act. What it did was it increased tariffs in the country on imported goods, which I think angered a lot of the lower classes and basically like the farmers and other people like that, laborers and all that. I think the industries wanted it, but not the workers. And so it caused a split in the Republican Party. It angered Teddy Roosevelt, and he broke with Taft and later would try to run against him in 1912 over that whole issue with that. So people start to think that Taft isn't really a progressive anymore overall. Of course, the other thing that Taft is known for, which of course I'll talk about, is he's famous for, here's of course the more slides if you want to see later, of course, on these different acts that were passed under him. But he's more known for this thing called dollar diplomacy, which Taft started using in the early 1900s. The so-called dollar diplomacy would eventually replace gunboat diplomacy. What was that? That was where the United States would use basically American money to influence basically Latin America, so we could control them. So instead of like trying to use the big stick and use force, gunboat diplomacy, we try to, the Yankee dollar. That's what we try to influence them by, because I guess our money's worth more than theirs. And so that's something that we kind of use to do to basically, create more of a sphere of influence. We still do that today. Pretty much all presidents, have pretty much done that. I think we had a few times where we had to go in and take care of some stuff like Panama, I know under George H.W. Bush or whatever, back in the 1990s or whatever. But anyway, the United States starts investing in Central America, like banks. We encourage, you can see mines, banana plantations, coffee plantations. We encourage investment in building railroads, things like that. So we're kind of trying to use money to basically investments to try to make friends with Latin America. We still do that today, of course, overall. So that obviously works better than trying to use force, more or less, which, influences markets. And obviously a lot of it has to do with trade, like I said, of course, before. So that's basically, some of the main things that really happened under the Taft administration, of course. All right, now I'm going to also talk about and kind of move on. I'll talk about as well what happened in the election that happened in 1912. The 1912 presidential election was probably considered one of the most famous elections in the early 1900s in American history. If you know about it, I told you before, in 1912, there became this rift between basically Teddy Roosevelt and Taft in the Republican Party, which was over progressivism, basically because Teddy didn't think that Taft was progressive enough anymore. And so what happened was Teddy Roosevelt started campaigning for president in 1912, and he came up with this new platform that he ran on that was called New Nationalism, which I think I've got a slide on that. New Nationalism, what he called it. And Teddy wanted to run on these ideas of progressive things that they could push into American society, government, and make it better. You can see a bunch of things, of course, that he wanted. So he wanted basically women's suffrage. Women didn't have the right to vote yet throughout the whole country. So women should have the right to vote. He talked about a minimum wage for women, 8-hour workday. For everybody. Social security system. Something that his cousin Franklin D. Roosevelt developed later with Social Security. he kind of came up with the early idea of it. National health care system for the country, regulation of business more, ease in amending the Constitution, because it took 3/4 of the states to do it. He thought maybe it ought to be less, maybe 2/3. Pro-union tariffs. So obviously he wanted to be, obviously the tariffs need to be a little better to support workers in general and the unions and all that. So those are all things, of course, he wanted pretty much. Those are the big ones right there, of course, that were there. Of course, like I said, he favored lowering the tariffs. Like I said, he didn't like the Payne-Aldrich Act, of course, that Taft had supported in Congress. Put in there, too, he also supported, too, which we've talked about already, use of the initiative, use of the recall, use of the referendum as political tools in American society overall. Of course, what happened in the election in Chicago, they had the Republican National Convention, and what occurred was the Republicans nominated Taft again for president. Yeah, in 1912. And so this angered Roosevelt. He thought he should get it. And so he decided to leave, form his own party, and he called it the Progressive Party. And of course, what happened was they had their own convention in Chicago that was separate. They nominated him for president also as well. So now you got this deal where they're split, where they got the Progressive Party, the Republican Party, of course, with Teddy Roosevelt and Taft running against each other. It's part of why the Republicans end up losing the election, because they're split. It's kind of what happened, I guess, in 2020. There was kind of this split where some Republicans broke off from Trump. We call them Never Trumpers or whatever they called them, I guess. Of course, they nicknamed it the Bull Moose Party. That's something that's very famous, of course, that's well known. And it came from a speech that he was giving in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where in the middle of the speech, right before he gave the speech, this man walked up to him and shot him on October 14th, 1912, a man named John Schrank. And I do have a little short video showing you of basically this assassination attempt. It was actually an assassination attempt on Teddy Roosevelt.
On October 14, 1912, former President Theodore Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to deliver a speech because he was campaigning for another run as president. Before he delivered his speech, he was shot in the chest by John Fleming Schrank. The bullet entered his chest but was slowed down by a steel eyeglass case and his thick 50-page speech. The bullet lodged itself in his chest muscle. Roosevelt had said that since he wasn't bleeding from the mouth, he knew the bullet hadn't hit his lungs, so he planned to continue giving his speech. While blood seeped through his shirt, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." It was later determined by doctors that Roosevelt was safer leaving the bullet in his chest muscle than removing it, so he lived the rest of his life with a bullet in his chest. John Fleming Schrank later wrote that he was told by the ghost of President William McKinley in a dream to avenge his death and that he needed to assassinate Roosevelt. Schrank was admitted to the Central State Mental Hospital in Wisconsin, and he lived there until he died of natural causes.
So there's a little video, of course, on John Schrank, of course, who shot Teddy Roosevelt. And so that's where the term Bull Moose Party came from, of course. And I think somebody asked him if he was okay, and he said, "I feel as strong as a bull moose," is what he said. And so the name kind of stuck, is what they call the party. So the Bull Moose Party, or Progressive Party, of course, that ran against, of course, in the 1912 election. So anyway, of course, yeah, but that wasn't it. They had a lot of other people, of course, that also ran in the 1912 election. You had also these other two men. You had four people running in 1912 in the election. They had Eugene Debs. He ran, of course, also as well. And he actually pulled about 1 million votes. He was a socialist, we talked about before. And, of course, you had also Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey, a Democrat. He, of course, also runs as well. And Wilson, of course, you'll see later, ends up being, of course, the one that wins. There, of course, is another, of course, headlines of him being shot. That maniac looks like it, of course, you see there. But anyway, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. who kind of was like a progressive, just like, Teddy Roosevelt was. A little bit about Wilson. Wilson was the governor of New Jersey, who was a progressive reformer, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt was. And he was also the president of Princeton University, in New Jersey. It's one of the Ivy League schools. Talk about that later. You probably know it's kind of controversial now today about him being president of it and all that. But he ran eventually on this platform, which was progressive, that was called the New Freedom, is what it was called. And it's kind of like Teddy's program that he had. It kind of had similar ideas, which the main ones he had was like he favored reducing tariffs to get rid of the Payne-Aldrich Act that we talked about. So, yeah, that was one thing that was similar to Teddy. He favored a graduate income tax, which Teddy did also as well. He favored the U.S. Senator's popular vote. I don't know if Teddy talked about that one, but that's something he wanted, which was later the 17th Amendment as well. I don't think it had been done yet. He wanted a national banking system, which would be like the Federal Reserve, which we have now. And so those are ideas that he, of course, favored. He also wanted as well stronger antitrust laws. You can see that little campaign picture there, bust the trust. That became one of his slogans, I guess he used, and campaign song, of course. And so he would actually help develop the Clayton Antitrust Act, which would strengthen antitrust laws in the country. He also wanted a federal trade commission to regulate trade in the United States, federal trade and also international trade also as well. So he had a lot of ideas, of course, Woodrow Wilson. Well, Wilson ends up, because the fact that you've got all these people running, in the country, he ends up winning the election pretty much in a landslide. I think if you look at it, he actually defeats them because of the fact that Teddy and Taft are kind of, splitting the Republican vote. And he won with only 42% of the popular vote in 1912. That's kind of like Bill Clinton when he ran and won in 92. He ran with a minority of the popular vote that was under 50%. And here's something interesting. Wilson got 435 electoral votes. That's a lot. Taft got 88. Taft got 8. Taft got 8. That's terrible. Yeah, 8 electoral votes. That's awful for an incumbent, by the way. Now, Roosevelt got 88. But I think the popular vote was more closer. You know about that. So that's basically how Woodrow Wilson, ends up winning the election because of the fact that, all these other people run it. You kind of gave him the election. And so conservatives lost. The Republicans lost at that point. And so the Democrats come in. Well, let me talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. He was a successful president. He was the 28th president. I wouldn't say he was the most famous, or the best president of the United States. I think he would be kind of like maybe somewhere in the middle, more or less. But he was controversial. That's one thing, of course, you may have heard about this as president. And when he was president of Princeton in New Jersey, you know about it, he was known for being kind of a segregationist. Like he refused to let African Americans go to school there. You know about this. And so years later, they took his statue down, took his name off buildings and things like that. And so that's kind of partially why he's controversial. And then also when he was in the White House, you know about that. He actually showed a movie that was called, you heard that movie called The Birth of the Nation? It's very famous. It's kind of a silent film about early American history. And it's about the KKK, mostly, about that. He actually showed it in the White House. Yeah. So anyway, he's kind of controversial. Some people think he's kind of racist, but he was known for like stuff he did in World War I, especially with the development of the League of Nations. It's something he's very famous for helping develop. Just like kind of a predecessor to the UN, United Nations. That'll be later. Wilson served 2 terms, by the way, 1913 to 1921. I'll, of course, get into some of the stuff early on. In the first term, you can see most of his stuff in the first term he did was he dealt with mostly reforms in the country, like progressive stuff. The second term dealt more with World War I and the aftermath of World War I, of course, later when it ended. Talk about a few domestic issues, of course, that occurred, of course, with Taft, of course, in the White House. First, let's talk about some of the things he was kind of known for under him. Yeah, they had the Underwood Tariff, of course, was one thing that he helped develop as president, with Congress. And of course, that was one of the things that we talked about before that, he had wanted to try to reduce, which was high tariffs in the country because of Payne Aldrich. And so in 1913, they reduced tariffs, which you can see. It actually reduced tariffs from about 41 to 29% in the country on thousands of imported goods. And also, they put something in it, which was very interesting, which I think was kind of controversial when they did it. But some of the members of Congress put in an unauthorized income tax in it. Like I think something for a tax or something like that was put in it because of the fact that the 16th Amendment, I think, hadn't been ratified yet. It was kind of up in the air at that point. I think that would have been unconstitutional, I think, later. But eventually they would, of course, adopt it in 1913. I think actually when Wilson comes in is when they eventually ratify it. So while it takes them 4 years, from 1909 to 1913, to ratify that and, create the federal income tax with the IRS later. And what's funny is originally with the income tax, you didn't really pay that much tax. It wasn't that much like it is now. And back in those days, like when it first came out, if you made $3,000 and less, you didn't pay anything. You didn't pay any taxes. If you made $3,000 to $20,000, you paid 1%, which isn't a whole lot of money. If you think about that, it's like what, $200 at the most. I think you're looking at right there. Highest bracket was 500,000 and above, and so you paid 6%. Now it's 37%, of course, for the highest bracket. So obviously back then they didn't pay as much taxes as we do now. Of course, the most famous thing domestically that he did that you've probably heard about is he brought in the Fed, which is the so-called Federal Reserve System in the United States. In the Federal Reserve System, as you know, is a famous national banking system in America that he helped develop with Congress. Came out in 1913. They usually call it the Fed for short. You probably heard about that. And what it did was it divided up the United States into a national banking system with 12 Federal Reserve District banks that they have all over the United States. You can kind of see here. And the one we're in, of course, number 6 there is based in Atlanta, you can see, but each one has kind of a headquarters of where basically that district is. So like the one it looks like in Texas, like Dallas, you got one in California there, San Francisco, all over the country. There's also a board of governors that helps run it, so-called Federal Reserve Board, they called it. And so that's all called the Fed, of course, today. It is controversial. There's some people that don't like it. The Federal Reserve, as you know, some people want to get rid of it, et cetera. But they think they created it primarily to create more of a stable monetary system, like to regulate money and so on. Also to, regulate the financial markets, the interest rates and things like that, to prevent the economy from imploding and things like that. And so that's partially why they developed it, more or less. Then I also had talked about, I believe it was the Federal Trade Commission. That's also something else that's also well known as well. I already talked about that a little bit already, but the Federal Trade Commission was set up primarily to regulate the economy, like the federal trade, also not just in the country, but also, I guess, international trade in general. And anyway, so that's something they create FTC that they have. And so that's something that was created in 1914 that you can see right there. So you have the FTC also as well. Also, they got that. So they have that. And you can see, by the way, what's interesting about the FTC that I did want to mention about, by the way, was You can see it issued trade regulation rules, voluntary compliance, and also proceedings. So things like that were also created that could regulate things between, I guess, the federal government and industries, stuff like that. Also, of course, other thing I did want to mention about is the Clayton Antitrust Act as well. That was something else that he helped develop in the country. That one strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was back in 1890, which they say was kind of weak. It didn't have enough teeth, and this one did a bunch of things. First of all, it made monopolies totally illegal. So prohibited corporations from acquiring stock of another. It created a monopoly, basically. So they made that illegal. You can see also that another thing it did, which was very interesting about the Clayton Antitrust Act, basically it said that labor unions had a right to exist. Can you believe that? First time that, of course, where the federal government, of course, said that about labor unions. Also said that strikes, picketing, boycotts, stuff like that was actually legal. So that's something new that you start seeing, of course, with America. And so it's interesting how that's kind of going on right now. So anyway, yeah, kind of, so those are all kind of some of like the domestic policies, like mostly that occurred under Woodrow Wilson. They did have a few other things I did want to mention about, which of course did happen, of course, also under Woodrow Wilson as well. Don't forget too, they had 3 constitutional amendments that basically were developed under Wilson's administration and came out. 17th Amendment. We talked about these already. U.S. Senators vote, popular vote, of course. So yeah, that's one. 18th Amendment. Of course, that's one of the most controversial I'll get to when I get to the Roaring 20s, but prohibition. They decided that they were going to ban alcohol in the country, which they did for about 13 years. You can see from 1920 to 1933. It was often called the so-called Noble Experiment. And that was really controversial because, it caused a lot of problems in the country, even worse, like the rise of bootleggers, gangsters like Al Capone, and it actually didn't really work. It did the opposite. Of course, the 19th Amendment, too, the women's suffrage or right to vote, that's something that also came out as well. Women would actually get the vote in 1920, by the way. So that, of course, happened later. By the way, Wilson did run for re-election in 1916, which I did. I guess I'll talk a few minutes about. By the way, he actually defeated Charles Evan Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice, who was a former governor of New York, also as well. And anyway, I guess one of the very few that did that. There was a justice in the Supreme Court who ran for president, and I think there was a talk of putting Teddy in. I think also again to run, but he didn't really want to run for president, and so that's why they ended up with him. And in Europe, they had World War I starting at that point, which had started in 1914. And Wilson ran on this slogan, which was, he kept us out of war, trying to promise that they wouldn't get the Americans involved directly in World War I. And it became part of a thing called the America First policy that they start talking about, where we got to, support America and not these foreign countries. And apparently, if you go into Wilson's second term, if you know about it, foreign policy started to become an issue. Mexico, which I'll get to first, of course, and talk about, with the Mexican Revolution. That is a big, big issue, of course, which actually hurt it. 1916 election, they thought he wasn't doing enough to really solve the problems with the Mexican Revolution. And then World War I was also a problem, too, because they had the Lusitania incident in 1915, where a bunch of Americans were killed. And so it almost caused him to not do so well on the 1916 election. I think the popular vote was not that close, but electoral vote was actually close. 277 to 254, where he barely won by 23 electoral votes. What's interesting about that right there. We'll get to Wilson later. Wilson, He was later president until 1921. And I've got a few minutes today. I think I'm going to go ahead and I will talk about, of course, one of the, I guess, first major foreign policy issues, of course, that Wilson's got to deal with as president. And of course, that's the so-called Mexican Revolution that breaks out when he's in power. What was the Mexican Revolution about? What was the deal with that? Well, what happened was in Mexico, the Mexicans had gone through a lot of period where they were run by dictators. I think the people in Latin America sometimes called a lot of the dictators caudillos, which meant, I think, a Spanish word meaning strong men. And they had a lot of these in Latin America, these dictators. And Porfirio Diaz had been the president of Mexico for years. You can see like around 30, 40 years he had been in power, running, re-election, I guess, every time. Mexico was enjoying peace, prosperity, you can see. But a lot of people, like the lower classes, didn't really have a whole lot of rights. And the country, by the way, was very impoverished. I think the Catholic Church also had a lot of power, too, in the country as well. What happened was the Mexican Revolution, though, and broke out in 1910, which would last about 10 years. It created a lot of economic, political, social changes to Mexico later, and created a lot of decline in foreign relations between us and, of course, Mexico. I'll get to it later. It also helped to cause, by the way, why we got into World War I. You may have heard of the Zimmerman Telegram, which kind of dealt with that. And so, yeah, that's basically what it was. The fact that Mexico needed internal reforms. They had this guy in power who was just really old. And so they want to change, and that's kind of what happened. And so what happened was in 1910, there was a deal where they had an election, the Mexican election of 1910 for the presidency. And there was this younger man that ran against him named Francisco Madero, who was a wealthy landowner. What happened was they think that Madero won. He won the election, but they think the election was rigged, where Diaz won. I think some people thought the 2020 election was rigged or something like that, maybe. But basically, it caused the revolution to break out, which you see was on November 20th, 1910. And in Mexico today, they still call it, if you know about this, Revolution Day. It's still celebrated as a national holiday when the Mexican Revolution kicked off, I guess, more or less. And like I said, it would take like 10 years for this revolution to really, kind of make changes and all that. And it was more like a civil war. People fighting against each other. There's different sides in the war as well. And what happens is the revolution slowly spreads. It starts in the city, I guess Mexico City, and spreads to the countryside. And you start getting like the other classes getting involved, not just the upper class, but the middle class, the peasants get involved, even like Mexican Indians get involved. And you get this deal where you get these rival dictators and generals that start fighting for control of Mexico. And you may have heard of some of these men that are, of course, very famous. You may have heard of Pancho Villa, right? He was involved, of course, in the Mexican Revolution. Emiliano Zapata, who's also known. Victoriano Carranza, I think that's name's wrong right there. Venustiano, Carranza, I think is his name, and Victoriano Huerta. You can check those names, by the way. Yeah, Victoriano Huerta and Venustiano Huerta. No, Carranza. Got that name wrong. Kind of mixed that up for some reason. But basically, yeah, they have these different dictators that are running, to take control of Mexico, and it creates a big bloody civil war. It's really should be called the Mexican Civil War because it was more like that instead of a revolution. What happened was Madero eventually, because people think he's pretty much the legitimate ruler, forces Diaz to resign. So he goes into exile. He leaves the country, Diaz, at that point. And Venustiano Huerta, who was one of the generals, under Madero at that point, forms this counter-revolution against Madero. And if you know what happens, Venustiano has Madero killed, actually kills him off. I think his vice president as well. And so Herta basically takes over the country at that point in Mexico. There he is, Victoriano Herta. He's basically got this military dictatorship that you can see there. And what happens is Woodrow Wilson in the United States decides that he doesn't want Herta to be president. It should be Madero or somebody else who's more legitimate. And so he claims that Herta is this dictator that's kind of, going against democracy, in the will of the people in Mexico. And so he supports this other general named Carranza. He wants him in power instead. Venustiano Carranza actually was his first name. And Venustiano is his first name. And he was another general and kind of later takes over afterwards, as well. And what happened was Wilson, he decides to basically, to prevent Herta from really having power, he decides to blockade basically Mexico's ports because apparently what's going on because of World War I right now, the Germans are coming in. The Germans are coming in to support Victoriano Herta, bringing weapons and stuff like that to keep him in power over the United States. And so Wilson blockades like Veracruz and other ports up and down the coast, Gulf of Mexico, Pacific coast also as well. And it leads to an incident which is very famous during the Mexican Revolution. It's an event that was called the Tampico Affair that happened in April of 1914, where I guess must be around Veracruz, I think it was. And what happened was some American sailors had been taken by some of Herta's forces, like I think in prison or something like that. And so what happened was basically Woodrow Wilson decided to send in American forces and seized the port of Veracruz, occupied it until they basically gave the men back, which they did. So we almost got in a war with Mexico at that point because of that issue. Eventually what happened was Carranza, who we talked about because of support from Wilson, eventually is able to seize power. He takes over Mexico afterwards, and so the revolution is controlled a lot by him. And so he seizes power, but if you know about it, what happens is the other generals and dictators that don't like Carranza, who's supportive of America, they anger them, and so Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, they also kind of get involved too in the whole revolution, mostly because they don't like Carranza. And here's of course here's a newspaper clipping showing of course, U.S. occupies Veracruz, of course, right there. But here is Pancho Villa, of course. Pancho Villa is a nickname. His real name is Doroteo Arango. And anyway, talk a little bit about Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was a famous Mexican bandit, general, maybe kind of a dictator also as well. He mostly controlled like northern part of Mexico in the Chihuahua region. And anyway, what happened was 1916, he decided to attack the United States, not because he hated America, but because he was trying to undermine Carranza's government. And you can see March of 1916, he basically invaded what is New Mexico, crossing the Rio Grande. And what happens is 40 Americans were eventually killed and wounded in the attack, even though Villa's forces are actually suffer casualties, heavy casualties. And it was called the Battle of Columbus. And what happens is it angers Woodrow Wilson. He's really mad about this Pancho Villa incident in the Mexican Revolution. And so what Wilson decides to do is he sends in basically U.S. forces, which are led by this guy named John Pershing. who we'll talk more about later in World War One. And of course, we've talked about Pershing's decorated American general. He had fought, of course, in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. Remember, he was one of the men that had helped storm San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. He was also helped in taking the Philippines, of course, as well. The American-Filipino War that happened around 1900 as well. And of course, he was involved in what they call the Pancho Villa expedition, which took place in 1916, 1917. It's called different names, Mexican Punitive Expedition also as well. And with about 10,000 troops, the U.S. forces invaded into northern Mexico, trying to hunt down Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa had something like 500 men. He didn't have that many forces, like a small army, basically. But Pancho Villa was like a fox. We never could catch him. And so today, a lot of Mexicans still kind of view Pancho Villa as a great hero. Really is, because he, outfoxed us, the Americans, etc. So yeah, they failed to, catch him. But United States is going to kind of, Mexico is going to be an issue later. It's going to eventually lead to the United States eventually entering, World War One. We'll talk about later the so-called Zimmerman telegram. That becomes a major issue where Germany tries to entice the Mexicans to join the Central Powers against the Allies in the war. They were trying to get the Mexicans to attack us like Pancho Villa did. So, that's going to be an issue because next time we'll kind of get into it. We'll talk more about, how World War One is going to break out in 1914, the so-called Great War, as they called it. We'll talk about how the causes of it. We'll talk about the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which kind of propels the war. I'll talk about the early conflicts in the war, like what happened with the European perspective of the war. Now we'll get into how the United States got in the war and how we participated in the war, more or less. And so that's it for the week. Of course, later on Friday, like I said, I'm going to talk about World War One. And of course, I will talk about our upcoming first exam, which of course will be posted Friday. So don't forget, if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, let me know, later on my channel. Don't forget about, of course, the current assignment you have right now, which is on the Gilded Age and the Old West. So make sure you do wrap that up. Of course, I will be, sending you reminders about that later. So that's it for today. I hope you'll have a great rest of the week out there. Of course, I'll see you again with another lecture, of course, on Friday. So y'all take care and see you later.